A very pleasant good morning to everyone here. Just want to welcome you to the debut episode of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling Podcast. This is going to be a very special episode. This is a project, a labor of love from TakersMinion and myself. Just going to be plumbing the depths of pro wrestling history, sharing the wealth of action and excitement that we've all enjoyed over our lifetimes as wrestling fans. We really think you're going to enjoy this. It's really been a long time coming. And of course, no podcast would be complete without its host and centerpiece. And our centerpiece is the esteemed TakersMinion of the Shootin Da Breeze Podcast. Taker, my friend, how are you? It's good to see you, buddy.
Good morning, Biff. It's great to see you. It's great to see everyone here that's wanting to learn a little bit about the older wrestling. That's what this is about. It's going. Let's hope this takes off and gets going. This is new territory for me because the Shootin Da Breeze podcast on Saturdays is pretty much a melee, and this one's going to be more structured. So something new for me, and I'm sure something new for Biff as well.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be an experience, but it's something that I think you and I both agree we could probably talk forever about if we really wanted to. There's just so much to cover. I thought what would probably be a good way to start this actually would be to talk a little bit about our fandoms and how we came into pro wrestling. And Takers, I know you've been a wrestling fan for even longer than I have. When did you first get into pro wrestling? And give us a little bit of, kind of a taste of your wrestling fandom over the years.
Well, my wrestling fandom started in 1971. Okay, I was 6 years old, I think. 6, 7 years old. My dad had it on TV one Saturday afternoon, and it caught my attention. I just sat down and watched with him. And that was back in the old AWA days with Vern Gagne and WWA with Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Schneider. That's their promotion out of Indianapolis, and they used to swap talent with each other. You knew everybody that was in the territories back then. I could throw some names out there that people wanted, like, who is that? Who is this? What did they do? I saw the likes of Cowboy Bob Ellis, the Texas Outlaws, the original Texas Outlaws of Dusty Rhodes and Dirty Dick Murdoch, Ernie Ladd, names that are known. But there's also, like I said, there's Pepper Gomez, who was a West Coast guy. I saw some of the original Sheik of Eddie Farhat. And I used to go to wrestling matches with my grandfather and sit ringside as a child at Chicago's International Amphitheater. So that's where my baptism started. That's where I got into wrestling. Sure, there were stretches where I didn't have the access to watch wrestling as much, but I did the best I could. Read all the magazines that were out there. Wrestler, Pro Wrestling, PWI, Pro Wrestling Illustrated wasn't really around then. There were only two magazines out at the time. That was Wrestling and the Wrestler. And that's where I got my information from. Biff, how did you get into all of this?
Well, actually, I had a family connection to this. My family, particularly my uncles, were huge wrestling fans growing up. And so it was hard to go to a family function early on without hearing wrestling talk. I became a fan in the late autumn of 1989, which was kind of an interesting time here in QC headquarters. We were still recovering from Hurricane Hugo, which kind of destroyed everything. There wasn't a lot to do here except watch TV when the power came back on. And one of the first shows that I kind of gravitated towards was the World Wrestling Federation. I am very much a child of the Hulkamania years. Really a WWF fan up until the mid-1990s. And as I got a little bit older, I began to explore a little bit more of the pro wrestling world. I started discovering tapes from Japan, really got into the Super Junior scene in the mid-90s. Of course, the Monday Night Wars in the late 90s, that was obviously a big time for my wrestling fandom. It was a good chance for me, my brother, and my father, who had kind of gotten into the wrestling around that time. We just all kind of gravitated towards those pay-per-views. Hard to explain for people that weren't around during that era how awesome it was. Every Monday night, you had two amazing shows to watch and to decide between them. And it would be a debate between your friends, especially here where I live in the Carolinas. This is kind of the heart of old WCW country, kind of ground zero for Crockett. As I got older, I got more into the territorial era. Just loved wrestling, do my research, kind of explore the different promotions. I think that's something that's lost today on a lot of newer fans. I think there's a general understanding that wrestling used to be very much a collection of fiefdoms almost. But what I don't think people appreciate fully is that there was no two territories that were completely alike. Every territory seemed to have its own unique style. And what worked in a place like the AWA or Florida, that may not work in a place like Memphis with Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett, or with Fritz von Erich down in World Class. And then you had your styles that were common in the Northeast with Vince McMahon Sr. You had the Crockett territory in the Carolinas. You had Continental, Georgia Championship Wrestling. All of these wonderful promotions that have their own unique styles, and it really makes you appreciate just how much of a variety existed with the territories, how much variety really exists in pro wrestling. And once you go down that rabbit hole, I tell you what, there is a lifetime of awesome stuff to search out, to explore, and it really makes you a complete wrestling fan.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. I mean, like I said, I just scratched the surface. I mean, people, I can tell you this, go on, they say Wikipedia is not the most accurate. Go look professional wrestling territories, and I think at one point there were some 45 to 55 different regional promotions, international promotions throughout the world. And a lot of people don't understand and don't remember that WWF, Vince McMahon Sr., Capital City Wrestling, that was his fiefdom, was part of the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, which was basically a cartel of the promoters who got together and formed this organization, and they recognized one world champion for the men's. And they gave him that's where you hear the story about the 10 pounds of gold. That's what that belt was actually 10 pounds of gold. It was pure gold.
That was definitely the centerpiece. That was the prize. That's what everybody wanted. If you were the NWA world champion, you were the man. But the NWA itself held a lot of control over the business, especially here in the United States, but really globally too. If you were a member of the NWA, you had a lot of power at your back throughout the 1950s, the 60s, and into the 70s. But it's interesting, as we got into the 1960s, we started to see some promotions begin to try and break away a little bit. Of course, you came of age with the AWA in the Midwest. They kind of had their little split from the NWA. Of course, the current titan of wrestling, WWE, beginning life as the World Wrestling Federation. Before that, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. They had their own little dispute over the NWA World Championship. And so, by the 1980s, we really had three distinct brands of pro wrestling in the United States: the National Wrestling Alliance, the AWA, and the WWF. Really, wrestling in the 1980s changed the landscape. It kind of set the table for the evolution of wrestling that we see today. But honestly, even with all the turmoil in the 1980s, there was still some tremendous wrestling to be found across all three promotions, honestly.
Yeah, yes, there was. I mean, my preference, like I stated before, was the AWA. That was my first introduction to professional wrestling, and Vern Gagne, the owner of the promotion, was also its champion for a lot of years. And it all boiled down to, in his eyes, if he could trust you, which that was something that hardly existed even during the time of the NWA. Trust from wrestlers to promoter and promoter to wrestler was next to non-existent. Because if you were, let's say for one instance, you were with Crockett, the Crockett promotion, and they pissed you off. Well, you could always go down to Championship Florida, Wrestling from Florida, and start fresh down there, and just give your notice and go. And there were some wrestlers that wouldn't give a notice; they would just leave overnight. And some had the promotion's title, and they took it with them, and there was a lot of strife back then.
There's actually a real famous story kind of tying into this. If you are a longtime fan of the WWE or WCW, you probably remember Wayne Ferris, aka the Honky Tonk Man. He had a very almost identical situation to what you were just describing, Taker. He was wrestling with Larry Latham in the Florida territory,
right?
Which was organized by Eddie Graham, and of course the Briscoe brothers, Jack and Jerry, had a big say in Florida during this particular point in time in the early 1980s. Essentially, Wayne Ferris, who is the Honky Tonk Man, and Larry Latham were not happy being used as underneath talent in Florida, and so they basically just said, "Screw you," and they just up and left. And that's how they wound up coming to the Memphis area. And no sooner than they arrived in Memphis, they engaged in one of the most famous incidents in pro wrestling history. One of the first real hardcore brawls that you would see of this type. Of course, it's the famous incident between the Blonde Bombers of Latham and Ferris, as they were known, against Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee. As the match was ending, the commentator for the Memphis promotion, the legendary Lance Russell, actually cut back on the air, and as the fans watched, there was a huge brawl breaking out in the concession stand. And so they're like throwing nacho machines and tables and everything at one another, and that was really one of the progenitors of what would eventually become hardcore wrestling over in Japan. There was a Japanese group that were in the Memphis area that saw this. They kind of took this idea back to Japan. And so hardcore wrestling in the 1990s, the very promotions that individuals like Mick Foley and Terry Funk would compete in, kind of got its start in the Memphis area from this angle. And so, not only do we see an example of wrestlers just up and leaving without giving notice, going from job talent, enhancement talent in one promotion to being stars in another. But we also see how wrestling kind of grows over time and evolves. And we see, the seeds of one style of wrestling planted in another promotion. Wrestling has so much richness like that. It just evolves over time. It grows. And it's fun to kind of trace the origins of one group, because once you start tracing the birth of hardcore wrestling, it opens up Memphis, or it opens up Texas, or it opens up all of these different avenues that you can explore. And that's really what we want to do here with the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. We want to set you on the path. We want to give you a little bit of history. We want to excite you, kind of, give you the appetizer. And really our goal is to have you taste this appetizer, like it, and go off and explore on your own. Because, Taker, I know, just from our conversations with one another, you are as much of a fan of wrestling history as I am. And honestly, I think you would agree, this show is as much about getting other people turned on to wrestling history as it is about you and me just having fun conversations.
That's exactly what it's about. I would love people to learn, go back and look at the history. I mean, yes, you can go on the WWE network and see the history of the big gold belt. And it talks about how that came into existence. I mean, the big gold belt, a lot of people think, that's the old NWA title. No, it's not. It's the World Championship Wrestling title from Florida, or from Georgia. what they did with that big gold belt is they recognized all the prior reigns that Ric Flair had with the NWA. Thus, that belt actually, the big gold belt itself, actually overshadows the NWA title. Everybody sees that belt and said, "That's the real world champions belt." When in all actuality, it's the NWA title is the greatest, is, the biggest championship in the world. Still is in a lot of places.
Yeah, that's another little kind of, neat thing about pro wrestling, I guess, is you would be surprised at some of the crazy history involved. Just that individual title belt, not even the championship it represented, but the physical belt and that style of belt, and just tracing it back through the years, it had quite a history unto itself. That might be a kind of a fun episode to do one day. But
we could talk about different world championships, what they look like, what they are now. Well, we could. But let's get on to the main subject at hand, shall we?
Yes, indeed. And of course, with this show, we want to highlight, important moments, promotions, performers. But one subject that's very near and dear to both of our hearts is women's wrestling. We actually were introduced in the nightly thread at Cage Side Seats, kind of talking about the very subject, really, that we're going to be discussing today. And that is one of the most revolutionary acts in not only women's wrestling, but I would posit, I guess, to say all of professional wrestling, particularly for its time period. We look at women's wrestling today, Taker, and it's really one of the most preeminent facets of WWE, and it's really become one of the most preeminent facets of the pro wrestling landscape in the current age. Of course, some of the most exciting wrestling in the world is being given to us by female performers. It's kind of this revolutionary age for women's wrestling. But women's wrestling itself has a very rich history, a very complex history. And so I really want to start off, just kind of setting the table for today's discussion. Tell us a little bit about what women's wrestling used to be like, particularly growing up as a fan of wrestling from the AWA or out of Indianapolis. Can you give us a little bit of an example of what women's wrestling used to mean for you as a fan?
Women's wrestling was, back when I first started, women's wrestling was more of a quote unquote attraction because there was only one person that was in charge of it all. And that is the fabulous Moolah. She was this champion for 28 years, I think, off and on. She basically controlled all of the women back then, and it was a sad state. It was always, she was always the one, the main attraction. I mean, we hear about Mae Young, we hear about some of the other women wrestlers that were around during that time, but Moolah is always the one that has the most name recognition for all the good things and the bad things.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, looking back, we really get the impression of Moolah as kind of a mainstay in the WWF or the Northeastern Territory with Vince McMahon, but in actuality, Moolah actually traveled around the country a lot. She began wrestling in the 1950s as a valet before she kind of transitioned into wrestling itself. And obviously, Moolah is a very controversial figure. One of the kind of understated facts about Moolah's career is that she was actually a big hand in getting Japanese professional wrestling organized, particularly women's pro wrestling.
Yes.
She actually traveled to Japan in the 1960s to kind of help organize women's pro wrestling. And this is actually one of the starting points for our conversation here today. She helped legitimize wrestling in Japan, and that opened the door in 1968 for a promotion to take shape, All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. Now, a lot of people believe that All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling was kind of the underling to the more famous All Japan Pro Wrestling.
It was completely separate.
Exactly. And in reality, All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling predates All Japan Pro Wrestling by 4 years.
Yep.
This was the first major women's professional wrestling organization in Japan, and quite possibly the first of its kind in the world.
It wasn't All Japan. Sorry to interrupt here, but wasn't All Japan Giant Babas?
Yeah, it began with Giant Baba's leadership. Basically, there was a schism in the Japanese wrestling scene. The two biggest stars in Japanese men's wrestling, Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki, they were kind of 1A and 1B. They basically would go on to form their own promotions. This was kind of the Japanese variant of the WWF versus WCW of the 90s. You had two major men's factions, New Japan Pro Wrestling, which of course is one of the most popular promotions in the world today, and Giant Baba's All Japan Pro Wrestling produced some of the greatest wrestling of the 1990s with luminaries like Kawada, Misawa. But, you know, it's interesting to think that these two Japanese promotions that all wrestling fans can kind of identify with, they actually are predated by a women's pro wrestling organization, All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. It began in 1968. And at the time of its closure in 2005, it was the longest running wrestling organization in Japan. And so that just kind of gives you an idea of some of the history involved with particular promotion. Really reached its heyday in the 1980s. Probably its greatest talent roster comes from the 1980s. But we want to focus on two in particular, and that's the subject of our episode this week. Looking at two performers from Japan that would wind up coming to the United States, putting on a series of matches with two American wrestlers, Judy Martin and Leilani Kai, over the summer of '87 into the winter of 1988. That is the subject of our episode. It is on the Jumping Bomb Angels. Now, Taker, I want to kind of plumb your knowledge a little bit here. When did you first discover the Jumping Bomb Angels? Were you able to watch it as they appeared in the WWF in the 80s, or did you come into them later on after the fact?
I was able to see the Bomb Angels wrestle on it was Saturday night's main event that would be on at 11 o'clock on NBC in my town out when I was in California in the 80s. You'd also see them on the morning programs that they had, Superstars of Wrestling Superstars. And folks, that's a little bit before a lot of your guys' time here. This was during a time where I was not having the access that I wanted to wrestling because of where I was geographically. I mean, I was living in Los Angeles with my family at the time. Yes, I had gone to matches at, I still call it the Olympic Auditorium. It's gone now, but it was a boxing and wrestling venue for two Olympics in Los Angeles, but I digress. But no, seeing them the first time I saw them, back in the old days when Vincent Kennedy was making his move, he would tape house show matches and have commentary that was dubbed in later. And the match, just recently that I watched on YouTube was from 1987 when the Glamour Girls had Jimmy Hart, the Mouth of the South, as their managers, and it was a title match at the time, and it was Gorilla Monsoon and Lord Alfred Hayes. God rest both their souls, two greats doing the commentary. And during that match, I saw a lot of things that I'm seeing today, and that's what how we started talking about this. This is what got us going on this series that we're doing, this show that we're doing, is we were talking about this, and you mentioned something about moves that they were doing back in the 80s are now in vogue now, 30 years later. It doesn't seem like it's been all that long ago. 30 years ago. And that's
yeah.
It's interesting that what's old is now new again.
Yeah, and that's really what's kind of so revolutionary about the Jumping Bomb Angels, and it's kind of one of the reasons we wanted to talk about them and kind of put a spotlight on their contribution. They really have a major role not only in their era, but really overall in the history of women's wrestling in the United States. They really are kind of the forerunners to some of the modern level of competition that we see today. Because I know, Taker, you were kind of alluding to it. Women's wrestling really in the 1970s, and even before that, was more of a special attraction. And I think that, if you look at women's wrestling in the United States during that period, you kind of get the impression that not only was it a attraction, but it really wasn't taken very seriously. It didn't have the cachet that men's wrestling had. That's really a phenomenon that we're seeing, evolve right now. It's very new still to go through a WrestleMania card, for example, and have some of the women's matches be some of the best on the show. The quality of women's wrestling has evolved so much over the last few years. Looking back, especially, pre-2000s, you really don't have that level of competition taking place very often in North American wrestling. And that's one of the reasons the Jumping Bomb Angels were, so revolutionary for their time. I know you mentioned just a moment ago you had found some of their matches. Honestly, their tag team matches with the Glamour Girls, you could take those matches out of 1987, put them on TV in 2018, and I don't think they would miss a beat to their contemporaries. You agree?
I agree. I agree 100%. I mean, we're forgetting that from the middle 90s up until 2016, we had the Diva era.
Yeah.
And the Bomb Angels would not have worked during that time. I mean, a lot of, I'm taking a slight segue here, but I think I'll tie it all up at the end. The style of wrestling that Moolah did, I'm going back a little bit, then I'm going to move forward, was very, very low on actual wrestling moves and more on hair pulling. She and that's what she taught. All the girls were taught to pull hair. That's it's the thing that you would see the most in matches, and still see a lot of it today. But the Bomb Angels were far beyond that. They were an aerial crew doing top rope moves. The double knees. One of the things you and I have talked about is the double knees that's used by both men and women today. The Bomb Angels brought that style here, where they would jump off the top rope and catch their boots underneath the armpits of the person and put them down to the mat. It's a big thing now, and back then it was huge because it was something you didn't see. The Bomb Angels were more luchadora types than they were actual, ground and pound wrestlers that most of your Japanese are today. But you see that, and it's like we're seeing it now. The Shining Wizard, the Bomb Angels did it, both of them.
Mm-hmm.
Either one of them could do it. And for those of you that don't know, that's the knee and shin to the face. The Kinshasa is another name for it that Shinsuke Nakamura uses. So you can see some of the moves that the Bomb Angels were doing have crossed genders.
Yeah,
the thing that makes it even that much makes them even that much more special.
Yeah,
they were doing electric chair moves before the Road Warriors were doing electric chair moves.
It's interesting you bring up the Road Warriors. One of the Road Warriors' big opponents in 1989, Dan Spivey and Sid Vicious, the Skyscrapers, kind of popularized a move that would become a staple, especially in the 90s and beyond, the power bomb. A lot of people think that Spivey and Vicious brought the power bomb into North American wrestling, but here again we see another example of the influence that the Bomb Angels and the Glamour Girls even had. They're using power bombs in 1987 at a time when that move didn't even have a name on North American television.
Right.
So it just reiterates your point of how revolutionary they really were.
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of moves today. Well, the simplest one, and that's what got me looking at them even closer, to something you brought up to me. You want to tell the people what that was?
From the 87 match with Wrestling Challenge?
Yes, we're the type of escape from a pinning combination, from being pinned.
Oh, of course. And I'm sure our friend Metal Matt will enjoy this one. The bridge out of the pin spot that Becky Lynch uses currently, invented or at least popularized here first by the Jumping Bomb Angels. You look at some of the moves that you can see them using, and you see the influence that the horsewomen took from them. That's really kind of a hidden treat to watching Bomb Angel matches. Is just picking out the different spots that women like Bayley and Charlotte Flair and Sasha and Becky Lynch would kind of lift for themselves years later. That's what makes the Jumping Bomb Angels such a revolutionary tag team. Their influence is felt today, from the bridge out pin spot to a bridging figure four, which they also kind of used at different intervals during their run. But really, Taker, we look at these two women, just absolute fantastic wrestlers. Even by today's standards, by the 1980s standards, I think you would agree, they weren't only just the best female performers in the world, but they were honestly some of the best in-ring workers that the entire WWF possessed.
I would agree 100% with that. And Itsuki Yamazaki was trained by the All Japan Women's Dojo. So, if for those of you that don't know what that is, that's a school that the promotion itself has. And when you first start, it's not like Tough Enough, people. When you first start in the dojo, you are lower than dirt. You eat last, you take care of everybody else's stuff, you clean the mats, you do everything. You're basically, and as you move through, and here's another, each promotion in Japan has a juniors circuit that they use. So there's that as well. You've got the All Japan Junior Women's, and that was the first tag team title that the Bomb Angels won. They defeated, who was it? Let's see. I know one of them was Lioness Asuka. So there's some history for you guys there to go check out.
Yeah.
They defeated, I'm getting it here. Yes. They won the
Chigusa Nagoya, the Crush Gals.
Yeah, the Crush Gals. They defeated them to win the WWWA tag team titles.
Yeah, and I think we should probably kind of give a little bit of background here maybe now on just who the Jumping Bomb Angels were. I mean, they had their famous run in WWF in 1987 and 1988. Obviously, they got their start in Japan for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. They both debuted in 1981. They worked their way up through the junior ranks. They actually had a series of matches among themselves for the really the tertiary title of the company. It would kind of be equivalent to the old television title level in WCW or the NWA.
Yeah, that's the juniors title.
Yeah, it's kind of like a lower level title, but they kind of broke in wrestling with each other. Of course, Itsuki Yamazaki and Norio Tatino, the Jumping Bomb Angels, really through the early 80s, kind of worked their way up during a period where you had some of the greats, Bull Nakano, the aforementioned Crush Gals, themselves very revolutionary and very influential in women's wrestling in Japan especially. But something that's interesting about the Japanese women's wrestling scene in the 1980s, there was an influx of female performers from the United States that were wrestling alongside some of the famous Japanese wrestlers, two of whom we mentioned earlier and we'll be discussing here momentarily in these matches, Judy Martin and Leilani Kai, who would go on to form the Glamour Girls. And it's really through the Glamour Girls that the Jumping Bomb Angels got a chance to participate in the United States with the World Wrestling Federation. Taker, do you have any experience with either Judy Martin or Leilani Kai as a fan in the 1980s?
No, I don't, unfortunately. The only time I ever saw them was the series of matches that they had with the Bomb Angels. And both, from what I could tell, the Glamour Girls, they were just as hard a working set of women that They did more wrestling, less hair pulling. They did more wrestling moves. That was the beginning of the change in women's wrestling here in the United States. Yeah. Then we had that 20-year off the track BS that makes me cringe whenever I say the word.
Is it because of the lens of Blaze?
Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting things, you can't really talk about the Jumping Bomb Angels in the United States without mentioning the Glamour Girls. And it's through the Glamour Girls that the Jumping Bomb Angels actually got their beginning in the U.S. I'll go ahead and recount the story here, and then, Taker, I'll get you to jump in here with some of your memories of the early matches that you saw. What ended up happening is Judy Martin and Leilani Kai were tied in with the Fabulous Moolah, who at this point still had a lot of clout within the women's wrestling scene here in the United States. And the WWF at this time in 1987 had brought in a very experienced performer, a very talented performer by the name of Sherry Martel. Now, Sherry Martel, of course, has her own unique contributions to wrestling. She's got a rich history all her own that we could talk about in a later episode. But one of the byproducts of bringing in Sherry Martel in 1987 was the WWF had begun to expand women's wrestling as an attraction. Bruce Pritchard talks a little bit about this with Conrad Thompson on his podcast, Something to Wrestle. Hardly recommend you go into their archives and kind of get his take. But Bruce was recounting the story. Basically, what ended up happening, Judy Martin and Leilani Kai both were in the World Wrestling Federation in 1987, but they were also making their shots in Japan. And they had some amazing matches with Tatino and Yamazaki from Japan. And they basically recommended through their contacts back in New York that Tatino and Yamazaki really could make for a special attraction in the WWF. And so that's really how the Jumping Bomb Angels kind of got their entry into the World Wrestling Federation in 1987. It was through contacts with Judy Martin and Leilani Kai and the matches they were having in Japan. They were so good in Japan that Martin basically convinced the WWF that, hey, these matches would be, excellent matches here in the States. That's kind of how they got their start. So we are in 1987. The Jumping Bomb Angels come in, and it's interesting, Taker. They are basically programmed exclusively with Judy Martin and Leilani Kai for the entirety of their run, which doesn't last very long.
No, about 6 months, I think, at most.
Yeah, it's only about a 6-month run. But in those 6 months, they had some of the most amazing matches. Tell us a little bit about your experience watching these matches. Did you have an impression watching at the time that you're seeing something truly special here?
Not then. Not when I was younger, no. It wasn't until later in life that I saw just how, as I've gotten to, into podcasting and have become somewhat a cynic and critical of certain matches and how the flow of matches goes. And I went back and looked at the matches on YouTube and basically put the discerning eye to them, broke down minute to, move to move, minute to minute. And to look at the work rate that these 4 women put out would put any man to shame today. These 4 women worked harder, stiffer, because than any of the men's matches we see today. And that's including Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar is known as being stiff. But these girls were putting their hearts and their souls into each and every one of these matches. They wanted their matches to be the one that the fans remembered when they went home. God, wrestlers today could learn, both male and female, could learn from these 4 women.
Yes, indeed. And I think that's one of the things that we'll kind of see as we look at their series in 87 and 88 is how much current roster learned from them. So we know now that they came in 1987. They lasted about a 6-month run. They were programmed exclusively with Judy Martin and Leilani Kai. From the outset, Judy Martin and Leilani Kai were just kind of wrestling as themselves. But as the series of matches progressed, we see the influx of Jimmy Hart to the heel side. This is where we really see the formation of the Glamour Girls. The WWF Ladies Tag Team Championship, a very unusual title all its own, was introduced here. If memory serves, I believe the storyline explanation given was that the Glamour Girls had won the titles in a tournament in Egypt, if I'm not mistaken.
You're correct.
It's one of those Rio de Janeiro style tournaments that
never happened.
Yeah, they exist out in the ether only.
Right. On paper, they exist.
Yeah, so they were brought in, these titles were brought in basically for this series. And so as you start, what you'll really need to do, if you want to find some of these matches, you can find one particular match on the WWE Network, which we'll talk about here. But really, you need to get on YouTube or another file sharing service online. That's where you're going to find the best examples of some of these matches. They were wrestling sporadically throughout 1987. They did have an early match on one of the syndicated shows. I believe it was either Wrestling Challenge or maybe Primetime Wrestling. But from the outset, we're seeing things going on in these matches that really just defy logic by 1987 standards. 1987 in the WWF, and this is not just in the women's ranks, but really in the men's ranks as well, you see a very methodical style, a very slow-paced style. WWF at this time period was not exactly what you would call a work rate heavy promotion. You had individuals like Ricky Steamboat, Macho Man Randy Savage, that could kind of provide the fast-paced, high-flying moves. You had tag teams like the British Bulldogs, the Hart Foundation that would work a faster style. But honestly, there was a reputation, and you can weigh in on this, that the WWF, especially in the late 80s, was kind of the land of giants, really known for more of a slower, methodical, kind of psychology-driven mindset of wrestling. Can you tell us a little bit about how wrestling in the WWF in the 80s might have differed from what we were seeing in the AWA and especially in the NWA during the same time period?
Well, the differences were similar. Were in the WWF then, like you said, it was the land of giants. Yes, this is a time of Hulk Hogan and King Kong Bundy, Andre the Giant, all in their heyday, all pretty much in their prime. And yes, it was slow, methodical. Hold a headlock 3 minutes, throw off the ropes, but try to knock each other down. Basic backflip, or back body drop, which they don't even call it anymore. Yeah, in the NWA and especially in the AWA, it was faster paced. Because the wrestlers didn't have a lot of huge, oversized wrestlers that were quote unquote powerhouses. They had more technical style wrestlers, both heels and faces, but they were more technical. But the heels would be the one that would punch someone in the nose or use the ever so present foreign object that the referee never saw to win a match. To really get the crowd and get the heat on the crowd. And AWA and NWA wrestling at that time still did a lot of television studio shoots.
Right.
Where you only have like 50 or 60 people there. Whereas WWF at the time was basically filming everything they had, would edit together a bunch of matches from, let's say, a house show at Madison Square Garden in front of 10,000 versus, or 5,000 for that matter, versus the 50 to 60 in a television studio shoot. So there was the big differences there. But the better, I always believed, and I've said this before, even during the Monday Night War era, I was more of a WCW mark then because I liked the style that they were doing. It reminded me of what I saw as a kid. That's why I was drawn to WCW NWA because of what it was like when I was a child. I always went back to that.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of this impression that the WWF always kind of lagged behind its competitors in terms of in-ring quality. The style of wrestling that the WWF employed, particularly during this era, was more showmanship based. You could tell, you brought this up with the studio wrestling shoots that the AWA and the NWA were still using at this time. WWF by the late 80s had kind of transitioned into filming almost all of their material in big arenas. The production values were different. It was shot a different way. Almost, you could say kind of a cleaner presentation.
You didn't have the ringside cameras that you've got today. Back then, you still had the fixed camera in the stands shooting the ring, and that's basically all you saw, really.
Right.
You didn't have the handhelds coming down the walkway or coming down the ramp in the wrestler's face like you do today.
It looked more real.
Like Legends Lover just said, it looked more real. We didn't have music accompanying people to the rings. You had to know the card and who was on the card and the order of the card. You didn't actually know until they hit the bottom. The people that were sitting close to the aisleway would know. And even back then, you didn't have the railings that you have today. The rest of the fans had to have police escorts at times to the ring because there were the crowd would just close down that area to where a very popular wrestler, be them male or female, would not have been able to get through there by themselves.
Yeah, it's just a completely different presentation between the promotions. You have, really what I always liken it to kind of a gritty, kind of a down and dirty Raw. It's kind of interesting. It's how Bruce Pritchard describes the pitch for Monday Night Raw, but that's really how it was, especially in the AWA. You had this real sense that it was no frills. It was all about the in-ring action. Of course, the AWA really made a name for itself by presenting some of, the best in-ring workers throughout the 60s, the 70s, and even into the 80s. They were known for being also no frills themselves. Whereas WWF really kind of compensated for its lack of in-ring work with the pomp and circumstance that we associate with the modern WWE product today. It was, the lights, the music, it was the stage setup, the banners over the ring. It was just this high-end production that was kind of masking, the lack of in-ring quality that we were getting from the NWA or the NWA. But that's what makes the Jumping Bomb Angels so fascinating, even in an age when wrestling in New York was slower paced, was not exactly what you would call high impact. They're providing matches that are blowing the doors off of people. They're running circles around 95% of the male roster, having matches that would stand up even today. And I think that's something that, really speaks to their talent, how good they really were. Not only were they out of place in the 80s wrestling around their male counterparts, but they're wrestling at a level today that would feel right at home in the women's evolution period in WWE.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. I mean, Tatino, she wrestled 29 years. She retired in 2010. But Yamazaki only lasted 10 years. And she currently, I believe she is currently here in the States and owns a sushi restaurant in New York.
In New York, yeah, that's correct. At last check, she's living in New York in the restaurant business.
Yeah, a sushi restaurant named Go. So if you're ever in New York and want to meet her, I'm sure she would talk to you, but then again, you never know. You don't know if she's even got any of her memorabilia up. She just seems like the type that when she left wrestling, she's like, I'm done. That's it. I'm done.
And, this is kind of interesting, too. We look at the Jumping Bomb Angels and their contribution to women's wrestling here in the States. They were definitely a popular act in Japan in the 1980s. But as good as the Jumping Bomb Angels were, they're not actually considered one of the top tier groups of workers.
No.
And I think it's kind of interesting, you look at some of the contemporaries that they performed with during that era, from Aja Kong to Devil Masami, Bull Nakano,
Linus Asuka, Jagusa Nagayo,
Dump Matsumoto, exactly. Some of these famous names from Japanese women's wrestling. Neither Tatino or Yamazaki, neither are in the AJW Hall of Fame, which was an organization established to kind of commemorate the best of Japanese women's wrestling. Neither made it into that Hall of Fame. So as of yet, it almost gives you a perception that, these two women, as talented as they were, they only represent kind of the surface of how deep Japanese women's wrestling really was, especially in the 1980s. And it just gives you an idea of how much there is to explore going back into the Japanese women's wrestling scene during this era. It really was just as prominent in terms of in-ring quality as their male counterparts in Baba's promotion or Inoki's promotion.
Right. But like I said, you don't see even with NJPW, you still don't see, they don't have New Japan or All Japan, which is back now. Or I think it is. I'm not exactly sure. They don't have actual women's divisions. It's strictly men only in both of those promotions, All Japan and New Japan. There are several all-women Joshi Puro or Purosu match companies that it's all women. You can go on the internet and find them. Just type, put in a search bar Japanese women's wrestling, and you'll see 5 or 10 promotions come up. There's Shimmer, there's All Japan women's wrestling. It's amazing that there isn't a strictly women's promotion here in the United States. They tried it with Glow, but that was more of a WWE. I think that was a WWE thing because it was similar. But there's actually not been a strictly women's promotion here in the United States since Moolah's time.
Definitely not on like the top level. I mean, you have groups like Shimmer, women athletes that would come across and promote shows. But really, we don't have the same type of scene that the Japanese scene provided for us in the 1980s and the 1990s especially. But it is interesting.
Hell, even now.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you brought that up because really, Japanese women's wrestling, it really kind of had almost a downfall of sorts in the 2000s. Most of the major Joshi promotions, Joshi Puro being the term for Japanese women's wrestling, for those that are unaware. A lot of those promotions, they did kind of fold up. Some of the stalwarts, like the aforementioned All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, Gaia Japan, also another famous promotion that showed its doors during this period. So really, women's wrestling in Japan has kind of been forced to undergo a rebirth over the last few years. And it's interesting we chart the course of Japanese women's wrestling compared to the women's wrestling scene here in the United States or in England or Mexico for that matter. It's just interesting how, while women's wrestling was being integrated into companies like the WWE over the last 30 years, women's wrestling in Japan was pretty much kept separate from their male counterparts. There's really not that crossover between women's wrestling and men's wrestling in companies like New Japan. If you want to see women's wrestling right now in Japan, you have to find all women's promotions that are generally smaller than their male counterparts. It's kind of interesting how, even as we see the women's evolution here in the United States, Joshi Puro is really starting to make its own comeback in Japan.
Yeah, and and you brought up a valid point that it's the in Japan, you've got the smaller women's promotions and the larger male promotions, and that's a societal thing that exists over there. Women are in one thing, men are in something else, and it's a sad state. But who are we to try to change how they are? We can only do what we do, and I'm going to take a slight segue here. That's the big complaint about the show coming up Friday from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. There are so many people here in the United States that are up in arms, so many fans that are up in arms that there are no women on the card in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. But yet they failed to realize that Abu Dhabi is different than Saudi Arabia, which is different than Egypt and different from, each one has their own belief structure. That's like the lower bowl is for families, the highest seats are for single men. You're going to have a predominantly male audience at this show. Yeah. Going back to the Bomb Angels, like you said, we would see them. I would see them flying around the ring. The first time I saw them, it was like, okay, who the hell are these people? Who the hell are they? This is back when the internet really wasn't in existence, so you couldn't, punch it up on the internet as put in jumping bomb angels and get information on them. So I had to start looking around in the magazines, and I was finding Japanese magazines that I couldn't read, but I was seeing pictures of them work from over there, and it's like, holy hell. And yes, people, over in Japan, women bleed. Even today, women bleed. So their style of wrestling was a lot harder than what the women are doing here today.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you brought up the Saudi Arabia show coming up. Of course, that's a very controversial topic right now in wrestling fandom, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people weighing in on that show over the next week. But, we look at the show in Saudi Arabia. We know that WWE's female roster is not going to be allowed to compete over there, and it just speaks on its own level to, handicaps that women face in wrestling, especially at the top level in WWE. But it really, it just kind of serves as a segue into some of the roadblocks that women have faced trying to break into the wrestling scene over the last 30 to 40 years, just from a perspective of just being taken as credible athletes. Women's wrestling, especially in the 80s, was not really about the quality of the in-ring action. It was more about the spectacle of seeing women in wrestling. It was a special attraction. And you mentioned the wrestling magazines. One of the, shall we say, interesting features of some of the magazines, not necessarily your Pro Wrestling Illustrated, but some of the other magazines that would exist, a lot of times women's wrestling, the covers that women's wrestling would receive in the magazines was relegated to advertisements for apartment wrestling videotapes, kind of seedier stuff. You didn't often see women's wrestling presented as a serious, credible performance in the magazines here in the United States. It wasn't until the late 80s in the WWF in particular where women's wrestling started to gain a little bit of acceptance. But even at the time that the Glamour Girls and the Bomb Angels were wrestling their famous series, women's wrestling was still kind of viewed almost by some fans as a joke. And I will admit fully, as a young child going back and watching some of these matches from the late 80s, I was more enamored with the fact that I was seeing women wrestle. I wasn't fully able to appreciate just how good of wrestlers they were. It took years to kind of go back and gain a deeper appreciation. But that was the perception that was created by the wrestling companies here in the U.S. Women were just kind of treated as oddities in wrestling. And that would really become prevalent in the 1990s when the Attitude Era rolled in. Then you started having kind of the sexualization of the women, they were really out there more for sex appeal than they were for their in-ring talent. And so honestly, you know, the late 80s and into the early 90s, you know, it represents kind of this early age where women's wrestling is trying to emerge really as this serious, credible product before we fell into the dark ages of the 90s and the early 2000s. But that's really kind of one of the interesting components here that's working with the Jumping Bomb Angels. They are very much blazing a trail for female performers that wouldn't be fully traveled for years after they were gone.
Yeah. And that's a sad state of affairs. I mean, they had a golden opportunity then to start the revolution or the evolution, whatever you want to call it now, then. But again, where the problem lies is moolah. There are rumors out there, rumors and innuendo out there that Moolah was the one that basically screwed the Bomb Angels over because they were too good in the ring for here in the United States. The crowd wasn't, she was trying to make everybody believe the crowd wasn't into them. Watching that match that they had with the Glamour Girls, at the end when the Jumping Bomb Angels got the 1, 2, 3, the place, everybody was standing, people were throwing babies in the air. You know, it was an event. It was one of those matches that stole the show on that particular night.
Yeah, and that kind of, let's use that right here as a segue into probably what would be considered the most famous match between the Jumping Bomb Angels and the Glamour Girls. And I believe this is the match that you're alluding to. If you go onto the WWE Network, find the very first Royal Rumble show. This is a very famous match between the Jumping Bomb Angels and the Glamour Girls. It was on the undercard of the very first Royal Rumble. Now, if you want to talk about a show that is unique all its own, we could talk at length about the first Rumble. Kind of surprising that a lot of people don't realize the very first Royal Rumble event was not a pay-per-view. It was actually held on live TV. It was part of WWE's attempt at counter-programming against a pay-per-view run by the NWA, the Bunkhouse Stampede. And for those that don't know what the Bunkhouse Stampede was, imagine a battle royal that takes place inside a steel cage. That was basically the concept behind the Bunkhouse Stampede. They were running this show, the NWA was, at, I believe, the Nassau Coliseum in Long Island, which was WWE territory. And during this period, WWE and the NWA and the AWA to a lesser extent, they were all kind of engaged in this war to really break out on pay-per-view. Pay-per-view was really taking off here in 87, 88. And both companies were starting to experiment with running pay-per-views. Up until this point, closed circuit television had kind of been the way that most promotions went about filming their big shows.
Which is how WrestleMania 1 was shown to the public.
Right, on closed circuit, right. And so, you know, pay-per-view was still very much a new thing in 1987, 1988. And Vince McMahon and Jim Crockett were kind of competing against each other. They were counter-programming. The very first Survivor Series pay-per-view was counter-programmed against Starrcade 1987.
No, it wasn't. The very first Survivor Series match, Survivor Series, if my memory serves me correctly, the first few were actually on the evening of Thanksgiving Day. They were on a Thursday. That's how my memory, that's how I remember it, is that it was a Thanksgiving Day thing. Let me look it up here to be sure. But I believe it used to be on Thanksgiving Day every year, and then they moved it to the Sunday of Thanksgiving Day, Thanksgiving weekend.
Well, Starrcade itself was kind of held on Thanksgiving for a few years, but then it kind of moved, I believe in 1988, Starrcade was moved into December for the first time, and then moving on from 1988, Starrcade would become kind of a December showcase in the NWA and WCW. But there's a famous story with Vince McMahon and Jim Crockett trying to get their respective shows on pay-per-view. And really the competition came. Vince essentially was trying to prevent Starrcade 87 from being carried on pay-per-view providers. And it's a really interesting story. Bruce Pritchard goes into far more depth than we can here. But to kind of
he was somebody in the know.
Yeah, he definitely had kind of a front row seat for it.
Yeah, he did.
But the gist of the story, basically, Vince didn't want the pay-per-view companies carrying both Starrcade and the Survivor Series, and he used WrestleMania as kind of a leverage piece to prevent cable companies from carrying Starrcade, which is really where kind of the battle between the NWA and the WWE really began in '87 over pay-per-view. We go to January of 1988. Jim Crockett going to attempt to run a pay-per-view out of the Nassau Coliseum in Long Island, and so Vince decides he's going to counter-program. And this is how we get the very first Royal Rumble, which was broadcast live on the USA Network. It was established as a show that was really not only featuring the Rumble as kind of a gimmick match to establish the purpose of the live event, but it was also...
Thank you, Pat Patterson, for the concept.
Yes, God bless Pat Patterson for that in particular. The Rumble itself was kind of a backdrop to the Hulk Hogan Andre the Giant contract signing for their famous title match that would take place several weeks after on the main event. A very interesting show, very worth going out of your way to find on the WWE Network. I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point in the future.
But the match itself, and I'm gonna interrupt you here. The match itself, and a lot of people, this is old school wrestling at its finest. Because on this is January 24th, 1988 was the first Royal Rumble. The tag match for the titles, for the WWF Women's Tag Team titles, was 2 out of 3 falls. Something that you don't even see today is a 2 out of 3 falls match. That's what makes this match. I have not seen this particular match, and I'm going to have to go check it out after we're over. I'd forgotten to look at this one because yes, it is on the network. This is one of the few matches that Leilani Kai, Judy Martin, and the Glamour Girl and the Jumping Bomb Angels have, and the Bomb Angels won the 2 out of 3 falls match for that title. They held the title. They held the title until the 8th of June that year, where the Glamour Girls defeated the Angels to recapture the title. And shortly thereafter, the Bomb Angels left.
Yeah. So really, the Rumble match was really kind of...
I do believe we just lost this gentleman off the show. Well, Biff. Oh, Biff. I think what he was starting to say is that it was an interesting time for women's wrestling. And we've said this before, and I'll say it again, that we can honestly say that women's wrestling today is surviving very, very well. A lot of the women today have taken skill sets and moves from the Bomb Angels, and
it's just been a big influence in...
Oh, there you are. You're back. You kind of dropped off there for a little bit.
Yeah, that was kind of strange, actually. I never actually lost internet connectivity. I was sitting here listening to you talk and just kind of muted me for some reason. But
yeah, so what were you saying?
Well, no, basically the Rumble match in '88 between the Bomb Angels and the Glamour Girls was really kind of the final major showcase that you would see on TV. The last match that you brought up, I'm not even sure that it actually ever made air, to be completely honest. It might have been a live event. But the Rumble match in '88 2 out of 3 falls, and I think we should bring this point up too here as we begin to wrap up our show this week. 2 out of 3 falls, that was kind of the standard bearer for title matches, really, in the 60s, the 70s, and even into the 80s. 2 out of 3 falls used to be how the title matches were done. And I think that's kind of, symbolic of how great these matches were, that in order to be given a 2 out of 3 falls match, the WWF recognized, hey, these 4 women, they're not just a side attraction. They're one of the main attractions here on this show. We could put them in a 2 out of 3 falls match and expect them to carry this action 15 to 20 minutes, and it'd be just fine. And I think that's a huge testament to their skill. It's a testament to what they brought to the presentation in the 80s. And it's really just a testament to how good they were in the ring, that the WWF trusted them in what was really a very important spot. They were one of the feature matches on the very first Rumble show. And, of course, the Royal Rumble, of course, would go on to be one of the preeminent events on the WWE calendar. If the Rumble hadn't worked out in 1988, it's unlikely that they would have, continued that concept. And so you have to give the Glamour Girls and the Jumping Bomb Angels credit. Their match, probably the best of the night for the very first Rumble show. And it really helped make that first Rumble show a huge success. And from there, we get the Rumble as a pay-per-view in 1989, and then it's off to the races, and it becomes one of the big 4. And that is just the richness of wrestling in itself right there.
Yep.
A tag team match with the Bomb Angels and the Glamour Girls helping to contribute to one of the most important wrestling shows in the world in the form of the Royal Rumble. That is what we want to bring out with this show. We just want you to experience not only the greatness of the individual matches or promotions, but see how these pieces all interlock together. It's a giant puzzle. We're giving you the pieces, and we want to entice you to go and fill in this puzzle.
Yes. You just a quick thought on the 2 out of 3 falls matches, because I'd seen one with Ric Flair defending the NWA title as I got older. The time limit on those matches, and I'm sure you've heard, I don't know if you've heard it, folks have heard it, I think you have, where Rick talks about 90-minute draws, 60-minute and 90-minute draws. The 60-minute matches were single fall. The 2 out of 3 falls, you'd always say, the following contest is scheduled is a 2 out of 3 falls match with a 90-minute time limit. 90 minutes. That's an hour and a half, people. Think about throwing yourself around the ring. Most of us, including myself, couldn't last 5. And here the girls, they had, if I'm not mistaken, they had an hour time limit to do their 2 out of 3 falls. But I think it was all wrapped up inside of 30. Yeah. But I digress. But the thing is that you have, there's history in everything that we talk about. The type of match, how it was done, the stuff that they did in the ring. It's all historical. Everything that the Bomb Angels brought to the United States for their short time of 6 months here. They did more for women's wrestling today than anything anybody else has done since, before or since. It's only recently in the last 2 years, about 2 years now, that the women are actually being put in feature spots on these pay-per-views. They're no longer relegated to the pre-show. No, they're on the main cards of pretty much all the pay-per-views now, which that was something you wouldn't have seen 5 years ago.
Yeah, we're really in the midst of the women's evolution for real. I mean, it's not just a PR catchphrase from the WWE. This is very much, new territory, especially for longtime fans like you and I, kind of experiencing this with newer fans at the same time. We're seeing women's wrestling being treated as a serious presentation, and it's really great to see, but, we just want to understand, and, promote the understanding that women's wrestling, it didn't just come into existence in the last 2 to 5 years.
Nope.
There are examples of great women's wrestling out there in the history of the business. And, really, if you look in the totality of women's wrestling, if you want the spectacle of wrestling, if you want kind of the glamorous side of wrestling, I mean, you can obviously find it with women's wrestling. But really, the Jumping Bomb Angels and the Glamour Girls was really one of the first times in the WWE that women's wrestling was treated not just as, a sideshow, but as a serious in-ring presentation, a serious part of the product. It's just a testament to how good they were. Of course, the big match of the series from the 1988 Royal Rumble, you can find that on the WWE Network. But definitely get on YouTube, search out some of this content. Not only from the WWF, you can find their matches from Wrestling Challenge and from Superstars of Wrestling on YouTube, but you can find some of the Bomb Angels work in Japan from All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling on YouTube as well. There's a wealth of content that you can find, but really we just want to kind of introduce you to the Jumping Bomb Angels, one of the most revolutionary acts in professional wrestling for their time period, very much forerunners to what we see today. And that's kind of what the goal of this show is going to be, Taker, moving forward. We just kind of want to set the table, whet your appetite a little bit, listening in on some of these extraordinary moments in wrestling history, and then kind of set you off, let you explore a little bit. Just talking with you, we could probably talk about these subjects for hours if we wanted to. We could just dovetail off into all sorts of different tangents.
Oh, yeah. I behaved myself very well, I think, today, because I didn't go off too far.
No, you did very well. I think I think we both were sitting here trying to restrain ourselves because we could kind of, spitball into all sorts of different directions.
Oh yeah,
so many different.
You brought up several names today that I do want to look at. Women's wrestling wise, men's wrestling wise. That we can always look at it on other shows, but I think this was a great introduction because this all started. I remember how this conversation initially started in the nightly on K-Side Seats. Is I asked the question of the thread: who were the last WWF Women's Tag Team Champions? And you were the only one that had a decent answer for it. And you said it was the Bomb Angels. We've realized later that it was the Glamour Girls. When you said the name, I was like, oh my God, that's a name I haven't heard in years.
It is a tremendous throwback to a lost era of wrestling that is very near and dear to both of our hearts. And that's what we're going to be focusing on, really. It's just, some of the classic moments, the classic promotions, and the classic talent, that they still hold up today. Wrestling was not created 5 years ago. Wrestling has a rich history. It has an involved history, a complex history. It all ties back together. It's that puzzle that we constantly, put together. We'll give you the pieces and we'll let you kind of fill in the blanks and really come to appreciate wrestling as much as we do. That's the focus of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. We are here to provide some excellent vintage wrestling for you, provide some knowledge for you, and just have some good conversation and debate about some of the most important moments in wrestling history. And so that's pretty much going to wrap up this show this week. Taker, where can they find you? Let's get some plugs in here before we wrap up shop today.
Okay, you can find me on Cage Side pretty regularly, both in the daily and the nightly. More so the nightly because I work third shift. And you can also find me on Twitter at TakersMinion. If you wish to have something talked about on this show, shoot me a message on Twitter and I'll try to get that information together and we'll try to get a show together on it. I also have my own podcast, which airs every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central with my co-host and partner, Mr. Dr. Senju. And Biff, you got some plugs for us?
Yeah, obviously you can find me on Twitter at Real Deal Biff. That's DILL like the pickle because I'm an idiot and wanted some catchy gimmick. But you can find me on Twitter. There's a long story tied into that I'll have to share one day. But you can find me on Twitter, Real Deal Biff. Same deal for me. You can shoot any ideas that you would like to see covered. Wrestling, we're never going to run out of topics to talk about. And we could talk for hours about any one topic. So we're going to have plenty of material to go over in the weeks and months to come. You can find me, kind of got my finger in a lot of podcasting arenas right now. Thursday afternoons, 4 p.m., myself and Ryan Sayo host the Queen City Express podcast, talking about the week in wrestling. I do a wrap-up show midnight Saturday evenings for the Queen City Express called The Last Call. You can also find that live streaming on YouTube. Got the trivia contest we've been running. That's the live drawing this coming Saturday. So be sure to check that out. Of course, you can find me at Cage Side Seats, Biff Kensington III. I'm generally there in the daily threads and part of the nightly threads.
If you don't fall asleep at your keyboard.
I'm working on that. I'm trying to get some caffeine in my system. I'm slowly building back. I kind of fell into the old fogey time slot, go to bed at 9 in the evening and wake up at 6 in the morning. And, I'm getting back into my youthful vigor. NOLA, New Orleans kind of took it out of me. So I'm getting back.
Okay.
I'm getting back at it. Excuse me, but definitely be sure to check out Shootin Da Breeze. It's I call it the greatest wrestling podcast of the Cage Side Seats family. It's one of the most fun podcasts you're going to find out there. Shootin Da Breeze, as Taker mentioned, 11 a.m. Eastern, Saturday morning. Great discussion, a lot of fun. Of course, we bring you the podcast you didn't know you need, and you probably don't on Thursdays with the Queen City Express. Want to throw a quick shout out to some of the other podcasts from the Cage Side Seats family. Too many to name. So many podcasts, so many great people are working on providing content. Just visit Cage Side Seats. Just kind of hang out in the daily and nightly threads. You'll see all sorts of links to different material that's up right now. Of course, we have our own little family of podcasts that receive plugs each week. Just a great group of talent that's producing all sorts of information about wrestling right now. It's really the place to be. Cage Side Seats is kind of the hive nexus of all of this great content. But we're going to continue to bring you content here too with the wrestling history talk that we provide. Taker, it's been a great show, buddy. I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes in the future.
So am I. I hope it works out. I hope it works out for us. I mean, eventually we'll go live. We're just going to have to, once things settle out with my schedule. So hopefully we'll be able to do some live shows in the future, but right now we'll just do it this way. I've got nothing else for it. So Biff, take us out.
Sounds like a plan. Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. It's going to get bigger and better from here, folks. If you like wrestling, you're going to love this show. And if you don't like wrestling, by God, by the time we're done, it's going to be second nature to you.
They'll love it.
He's TakersMinion. I'm Biff Kensington. This is the debut episode of the Wrestling Connoisseurs. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next week.
See you next week, folks.